All right, so this is Social Work 207, Social Welfare Policy 1. My name is Jin Kim, and I'll be your instructor this semester. I'm a sixth-year assistant professor here at Northeastern Illinois University. I previously got my PhD at Wisconsin-Madison. I was there for 6 years, and so this is in total my 12th year teaching at the post-secondary level. I'm the policy curriculum specialist in our program, which means that I get to coordinate all the different policy sections in terms of developing and maintaining the content that you guys all learn in your policy classes. And so that's just a little bit about me. And so this is our first lecture. I'll be lecturing for 12 weeks online. So this is the first of 12 weeks of online lecturing. And so the first topic, this is just a basic introduction to social welfare policy. In this lecture, I'm going to provide just a quick definition of social welfare policy, give you some examples so that we have a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about social welfare policy. And then we'll think about different ways that we classify all the different policies that are out there. There's certainly lots and lots of different social welfare policies, and so we'll think about different schemes just to get our head wrapped around all the different policies that are out there. That'll give us sort of a broad overview of all the different programs that we'll be studying this semester. And then in the third part of this lecture, which I'll probably make that the second part of this video. So in the second part of this video, I'll talk about equity, social justice, and different sort of philosophical approaches to thinking about equity or fairness or social justice. We'll get more into that definition, but generally just talking about allocations of resources or distribution of resources in our society and what might be deemed fair, and different views of the fairness of those distributions of resources. And so that's the third major topic in this lecture. So we're going to dive in. We'll take a look at different definitions of social welfare policy. That seems like the right place to start. We'll start to define social welfare policy here. And so the first place that I look, I'm looking at Wikipedia, because I figure this is probably where students will look first if they need some quick information. And this is what Wikipedia has to say about the definition of social welfare policy. They say it's that part of public policy, and so that should tell us something. It's telling us that it's narrower. When we think about social welfare policy, it's certainly narrower than when we say public policy, and so it's sort of a branch of public policy. That part of the definition I think is helpful for our purposes. And then taking a look at the second part here, it says that part of public policy that has to do with social issues, right? It has to do with social issues. For me, that statement is a little bit general. That's not very helpful. That second part is not very helpful for our purposes. But it does give us a sense, right? It gives us a sense. We're talking about a branch of public policy, and that's really the takeaway from this definition. We'll go to a more credible source, and that's the Harvard University Policy Center, their Social Policy Center, Malcolm Leaner Center for Social Policy. And here they're offering up their definition, not necessarily of social welfare policy, but of social policy. And so once again, they say that it's public policy, and they take it a step further. They say it's public policy in practice, and so they're suggesting it's not just theoretical, but the application of policy is what they're getting at there. And then they're a little more specific than the Wikipedia definition. They name the specific areas that might be involved when we think about social policy. Now, mind you, once again, we're not talking about social welfare policy here. We're talking about social policy. And so they name these different areas. They say the areas that we're typically concerned with are healthcare, education, criminal services, or criminal justice, and so forth. And so we're talking about social policy here. This is helpful for our purposes, but it's not as precise as we wanted in terms of defining social welfare policy. And so this is taken from your textbook. This is the definition that we want. It's most specific with respect to what we're thinking about in terms of social welfare policy. And so Denito says this. She says that it's basically government action, right? We have to be talking about the government, right? It's not just government action, but it could be inaction, right? So what governments choose to do or not to do. Governments not only take action, but sometimes they're leaving something untaxed, for example. So government inaction might be considered social welfare policy. And then they're very specific with respect to the types of benefits and services that are involved. They're talking about income. Well, the term services is pretty general. They talk about healthcare and opportunities, right? That last term is a little more general. So we're talking about government action providing income and services and opportunities. And this is where we're getting much more specific in the way of social welfare policy. We're talking about government action with respect to vulnerable populations, right? If it's government action that affects a vulnerable population, then that's what we mean when we talk about social welfare policy. And so those different groups are categories of persons in our society that we think of as vulnerable populations. So the aged, the disabled, the poor, those, if it's government action or inaction for that matter, that affects a vulnerable population, we're talking about social welfare policy. Let's take a look at some examples here. We'll run through some examples. So the first is Social Security. Right? Social Security, this is an income support program. The major benefit being provided is cash assistance. And the populations being served, we're talking about the elderly, or older adults, we should say. Older adults and persons with disabilities. And so think back to the definition that we want for this course, the Denito definition. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, is there government action? Certainly, we have government action because we have income support being provided by the government, cash assistance, so it fits the first part of the definition very nicely. And then, of course, the second part, we have to think about whether a vulnerable population is being affected. And so we just said this is a program serving the elderly or older adults and persons with disabilities. So I think this is a prime example of a social welfare policy, right? Vulnerable population being affected by government action. The second program here, supplemental security income, is sort of the sibling to Social Security. And so you'll notice in the term Social Security, the last letter there, the I, stands for insurance. And so Social Security is an insurance program, but supplemental security income is a different type of program. You have to be poor to receive supplemental security income. It's a cash assistance program, once again, serving the elderly and persons with disabilities, but you have to be poor, right? It's not an insurance program. We'll talk more about these distinctions later on this semester, but so let's think back to our definition. Is it government action? Of course it's government action. We have a government cash assistance program, and then we have the same populations that are served as under Social Security. We have the elderly and persons with disabilities, so that fits our definition nicely. That's social welfare policy, certainly. The third example here, temporary assistance for needy families. Once again, we have cash assistance being provided by the government. This is what we call TANF. This is the formal name given to our welfare system. And so certainly when we think about welfare, those of you who think about that term or have thought of that term before, I think most would associate welfare with government assistance. And so certainly we have government action if it's the first part of our definition. And then we have to think about whether vulnerable populations are being affected. Welfare serving poor populations, that is persons who are low income and with low assets for that matter. And so certainly fits our definition of social welfare policy. Vulnerable population being served. These next two are our public health insurance programs, as opposed to private health insurance programs, your employer-sponsored programs and such. And so we think about what's being provided. It's health insurance coverage, right? So once again, it's government health insurance coverage. The government is involved, so it fits Denito's definition, the first part. And then thinking about whether vulnerable population is being served, certainly the elderly in the case of Medicare, and then also persons with disabilities. And the Medicaid, you have to be poor to receive Medicaid. You can be any age. And so that fits our definition. It's a vulnerable population. The poor are being served or being provided with health insurance or government health insurance. And then finally, Child Protective Services, or in Illinois here, we have the Department of Children and Family Services, or DCFS. That's certainly an arm of the government. And so there's government involvement. That fits the first part of the definition. And then we think about the population. Certainly these are maltreated, and I'm using that term broadly to encompass abused, neglected, exploited, and such. But that certainly fits our definition of social welfare policy. All right, a few other examples here. We're thinking about foreign policy, military policy, environmental, educational, tax policy. These are a little more in the gray area. The first one, let's just take the first one here for a sec. We're talking about foreign policy. So foreign policy, sometimes students will raise their hand in class and they'll say, well, professor, there might be a vulnerable population being served. So if you make a case that it's a policy, it's an international foreign policy that is directed towards a vulnerable population or a vulnerable country, perhaps, for that matter, that might be considered foreign policy. But for the most part, we don't cover foreign policy in this class. Generally speaking, if we're talking about foreign policy generally, we're probably not talking about social welfare policy per se. Military policy. So not covered in this class. We're talking about the armed services, the Army, the Air Forces and famous Navy SEALs and such, government regulation of the armed services. And so that doesn't fit the second part so well, I think. Environmental policy. This is government regulation with respect to the environment or things affecting the environment. So I don't know that necessarily there's a vulnerable population being served. We don't talk about environmental policy in the social welfare policy class. You would probably talk about it in a public policy class. But once again, in the gray area, so long as you make the case that there's not a vulnerable human population being affected necessarily. And then education policy. This is probably a little more directly under the umbrella of Donito's definition. And so when we think about education policy, we're certainly talking about a vulnerable population if you think of children as being vulnerable. So to that extent, we're talking about, well, it's government action, but we don't want to forget about the first part of that definition. We're talking about local governments financing our schools and such. And so this, we'll certainly talk about education policy, not necessarily in this policy class, but in your second semester policy class, we'll talk about education policy. I think that's a pretty slam dunk case of social welfare policy. And then tax policy. So this is a little more fuzzy, I think a little more in the gray area, to the extent that you make a case that the tax policy in question affects a vulnerable population. If it's a tax policy directed specifically to low income individuals or to low income workers, perhaps, in the case of EITC, for example, that's certainly social welfare policy. We'll talk about EITC, but to the extent that we're talking about a general tax policy, not necessarily within the scope of our definition in terms of tax policy. All right, this next part, the second part, we're talking about different ways to classify all the different policies that are out there. So we just gave you a sampling of some of the different policies that we talk about in a social welfare policy course. And so we'll think about, this is sort of an academic exercise about how to group all these different policies. And so one way in which we group policies, all these social welfare policies, is by thinking about how one becomes eligible for the policy in question. Okay? And so one of the first distinctions that we make is between social insurance. We can sometimes classify social welfare policies as being social insurance in their structure, or public assistance, and we'll talk a lot more about this distinction between social insurance and public assistance. We'll be using this terminology throughout the semester, but social insurance, as the term suggests, it's an insurance program, government-sponsored insurance, right? So you're putting something in to get something out, essentially, and so to become eligible, right? So if you become eligible for that government program, by way of your contributions, we typically consider that a social insurance, social welfare policy. And then we have public assistance programs. And if we think about how one becomes eligible for public assistance programs, it's not through a contribution, but it's on the basis of low income and often low assets as well. And so those programs that require low income and assets to qualify, those we classify as being public assistance, just generally speaking. And then the second distinction that we make, I'm not a big fan of this distinction because these terms don't have much legal meaning. That is, the courts aren't very clear in terms of interpreting these terms, entitlement and non-entitlement. But just academically speaking, we're talking about entitlement programs. It's like it sounds. If you're found to be eligible for a particular social welfare policy, and there's an obligation on the part of the government to provide you with that benefit or service offered under that program, we typically call that entitlement program. Right, so one sort of litmus test on the face of a program, if you see that a program has a long wait list, that's probably not an entitlement program, right? Because under an entitlement program, under the definition that we're providing, if someone were found to be eligible, they must be provided with the service, but with a waiting list, of course, that evidences that they're not automatically being provided with benefits or services under that program. And so the corollary, the natural corollary is that in a non-entitlement program, even if you're found to be eligible for a particular program, a social welfare policy or program, there is no obligation on the part of government to provide you with that benefit or service. The prime example here being our public housing that's offered, sometimes referred to as Section 8 housing historically. So our government housing, even if you're found to be eligible in certain public housing authority jurisdictions, you'll see years and years of wait. I'm somewhat exaggerating, not too much, but you'll see these long wait lists, and so those are that's evidence that certainly that's not an entitlement program. That's not something that government must provide you if you're found to be eligible. So we just got through thinking about classifying all the different social welfare policies by how one becomes eligible for a particular policy or program. Now we're thinking about how we classify based on the type of service or the benefit that's offered. And so it's just a listing here of the different types of services that are, or benefits that are offered under social welfare policies, different social welfare policies. And so we've talked about a few of these already. So income maintenance, what your textbook author refers to as income maintenance or income support. In other words, cash assistance, where cash assistance is being provided. So OASDI, we're talking about old age survivors, disability insurance, Social Security. There's cash assistance being provided. We can group those programs. TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, that's a cash assistance program. SSI, Supplemental Security Income, other cash assistance programs, is providing income support, right? So we classify, we group these policies, we dump these, I don't want to say dump, but we're putting these policies into one particular bucket, right? Into the income support bucket. And then we have nutrition programs. Major service that's being offered is in the way of nutrition assistance, right? SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's the formal name of the federal food stamp program, right? So when where people used to call it the food stamp program, or is formerly named the food stamp program, is now the supplemental, is now SNAP. And so it's providing nutrition assistance, right? And so all the programs providing nutrition assistance, we can classify those together. So WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, under the same arm of the government, that's the Department of Agriculture. School lunch program, the same arm of the government, Department of Agriculture, providing nutrition assistance. Those we can group together. Healthcare, right? I should change that to health insurance, actually, right? The major service being offered Medicare, Medicaid health insurance coverage, right? And by extension, healthcare as well. But health insurance, we can group those together. Social services, right? We have programs providing social services in the way of vocational rehabilitation, that is helping low-income folks or vulnerable populations, generally speaking, helping them find employment, right? And then community counseling programs, these might be grouped under social services generally. And then we have our tax programs, right? The EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, as we mentioned before, it's a program targeting low-income workers. So it's a tax benefit being provided. We group those programs together. The child tax credit, right? That's a tax benefit being offered on the basis of the number of children. It's a non-refundable tax credit. And then we have, I just note here, untaxed health benefits, meaning that your private health insurance, your employer-sponsored health insurance, or the one that you bought on healthcare.gov perhaps, right? Your private health insurance benefits that aren't subject to federal income taxation, right? Those benefits aren't subject to federal taxes. The fact that they escape tax liability might be considered a tax benefit. So that's why I'm just kind of throwing that in here, right? So that concludes the first part of this lecture. In the last part of this lecture, we'll talk about this notion of social justice, about allocations of resources in our society and what might be deemed, and at least two different approaches to thinking about what might be deemed equitable or fair in our society.